So I'm talking right now with Sathiya Sam. He has a new book out called The Last Relapse. Sathiya, you have a history of dealing with pornography, overcoming pornography, and now helping other men do the same. So tell us a little bit about yourself, about your story, and how you got to this point in your journey.
Yeah, thanks for having me here, Trey. And dude, you pronounced my name right as well, so job well done. That in of itself is an accomplishment. But yeah, basically, I grew up very churched. I'm a fourth generation pastor, so dad, grandpa, and great grandpa were all pastors, and my parents were the kind of people who were the same on off the stage that they were on the stage. So the home was good. My parents even forked out the money for us to go to a Christian school, get a Christian education. Everything was set up for me to have a pretty good life. And I got exposed to porn in the computer lab of my Christian school when I was 11 years old. So that was the beginning of sort of this journey for me. This is in 2001. So this is before broadband internet. This is before smartphones. But even back then, the research was showing the average age of first exposure to porn was roughly 11 years old. So I fell smack in the middle of that typical age where you just get exposed, between online content and whatever else. Anybody who's had a struggle knows that your first time is never the last. And so I wasn't addicted overnight, but as I started to enter puberty, become more curious, and just develop sexually, I started to look around a little bit more. And that became a regular habit in high school. By the time I was in university, it was a full blown addiction. And what I mean by that is I would plan my days around watching it. It was a staple. I didn't really go a day without it. And it was the only way I knew to cope with the pressures of life, of pursuing an education. And I worked part time, and I had, four figures of research grants. So I was working really hard academically, and this was the only way I knew to cope. And it's where I also met Jesus. Ironically, I was in a very atheistic environment studying
Mm.
biological sciences. That's where I really gave my life to Christ and committed it to Him. And when that time came, I knew, okay, with this decision comes some lifestyle changes. Like, I grew up in the church, I'm a pastor's kid, I know how this goes. And one of those changes was to get rid of porn. And I couldn't, no matter how hard I tried. And that's when I realized I really had a problem. I think up until then, I told myself, I can kick this thing when I want. I'll stop when I need to. When I get married, it'll fix it. Just all those lies that we tell ourselves that are totally false. Um, and so that's when I realized I need to get some help. And it took me about 5 years to figure out how to actually get free of something as debilitating as porn addiction. But eventually I did. And I made up my
Mm.
mind in that season that when I figure this thing out, I will do everything in my power to help as many other guys get free as well. And so I was free for about 2.5 years before I kind of felt a release from the Lord to step out and to start Deep Clean, which is my ministry, and has now led to the launch of this book, The Last Relapse, which really just details our system and how we have helped hundreds of guys experience the same freedom that I have in my own life.
And look, I think pornography is there's nobody in our day and age in our culture who does not have some sort of experience with pornography, whether it's firsthand experience or you are involved with a partner who has a serious issue with pornography. Everybody seems to have a story now with pornography, and I think the issue so often is it's such a pervasive problem, and it feels like you walk into your bedroom and it's a complete mess, so you just don't clean it at all because you're overwhelmed by
Yeah.
how messy it is. And I think that's pornography. So I think for people to just get over the awkward hump of saying, I've got a problem and I don't know how to deal with it. What word of wisdom would you give to guys who are in that place saying, I know I've got a problem, but I just can't bring myself to take the first step?
Yeah, I mean, as a starting point, I would just say, hey, I totally get it. You're the majority. That is a majority of the men out there that are watching. They don't want to watch. They know they need the help, and it's either too costly to get the help, or they don't know where that help would be. Um, the thing we
Mm.
always tell guys is it is better that you confess than get caught. And that is true whether you're in a marriage or not, in a relationship or not. Getting caught could just be that it affects your work, it affects maybe your spiritual life, whatever. It's better to take that first step, to be proactive, to do the hard thing up front so that life can get easier afterwards. And I think what that might look like really practically is finding somebody safe that you can talk to. A lot of people kind of get told like you have to tell your parents or you have to tell your loved one. You do have to tell your loved one for sure if you're in a committed relationship, but when and how, that varies depending on the situation. But ultimately, you just need to tell somebody who's safe, somebody who's going to say, "Hey, I love you anyway. I got your back. I'm going to see you through this. Let's get you some help." That's always a great starting point. And I think for people who are really
Mm.
serious and are like, "Okay, I'm actually sick and tired of this. I know I need to get rid of it." Then you have to take massive action. So you got to reach out, get some professional help, go through something where you're really going to get a person who's been there to kind of guide you along the way. And I think those are kind of some of the steps you'll probably have to take if you really are serious about putting a dent in this
You said that you were raised in a Christian home, so you were surrounded by a lot of the spiritual tools. We can abstractly talk about them and the spiritual things that are necessary to fight back against these things that we deal with. One of them, a big one, obviously, being pornography. So when you started going through the process of realizing you had an issue and you wanted to solve it, what was that spiritual journey like for you personally? How did you see God either slowly or quickly transform your heart and mind in that process?
That's a fantastic question. So there's two arenas in the spiritual realm that are really critical for the recovery process. True in my story and true in the guys that we help. The first is really dealing with the demonic component. The reality is when you engage in something as toxic as pornography, you're almost like literally dancing with the devil. Like you're really engaging with something demonic and giving him a foothold. Now, personally, we don't really address this component until later because what we have observed is some people will go and they get delivered. God will do a supernatural work in their lives, and it will
Mm,
last for a couple days, weeks, months, maybe even a year or two, but then they relapse again. And the main reason is because they haven't built the spiritual maturity to actually sustain the breakthrough. So they get a little burst of it, but long term they still struggle. And so we do that on the back end. We talk about how to really just break off any influence and any foothold that the devil might have in your life that you've given him. But on the front end, what we do is we teach people to mature spiritually. And for me, a huge part of that was learning to engage with God from a relational standpoint. I grew up very religious. I knew how
mm,
to like pray, read my Bible, wake up early, spend time with him. Not that I didn't do those things, but I did them to earn his love. And part of my maturation process was understanding my unconditional acceptance and love in God. And I think when I realized that God loves me unconditionally, and I was really able to take that in and let it impact the way I viewed myself, the way I viewed the world, that's when my decisions started to change. And that's what actually cultivated the maturity that was necessary to then get some deliverance and to get some spiritual breakthrough that way. So I still get up in the mornings. God gets the first hour of every single day during the week. I read my Bible rather. I pray, I worship, I fast 24 hours a week. Like I do all that stuff, but it's different now because I do
mm.
it to enhance my relationship with Him. I don't do it to earn love or to prove myself or anything else. And that's a huge part of the recovery process. It is learning to redefine yourself and see yourself as somebody who is worthy of unconditional love. And it's from that place of spiritual maturity that we can then have the spiritual breakthroughs, the deliverance, and everything else that would come later on.
Hmm. Yeah, I think so often in a journey out of pornography, it's a constant ebb and flow of feeling encouraged and confident to feeling discouraged and maybe depressed, particularly when there's relapses, right? And I think that's you touched on something that's so important about why we need the spiritual component, because when we relapse, I think there's a feeling of I've been defeated. I'm not going to get this right. But the reality is that healing and recovery is not a straight incline. We want it to be a straight incline, but it's not. There's rocks and there's bumps and there's valleys along the way. So how can you shore up your the vertical, I guess, the spiritual relationship to know when I've got a relapse horizontally? When I mess up this way, how can I ensure that my relationship with Christ is still where it needs to be so that I can get back onto the right track?
Yeah, so I'll tell you what not to do because this is what I did for the 15 to 17 years that I was addicted and trying to get free. What I used to do in those days is after I would relapse, I would come back to God. That's a good thing, but I would come back to God and I would say, "Woe is me! I'm a terrible person. Please forgive me." And I would make these promises. God, I'll never do this again. This feels so terrible. I'll never do it again.
Hmm.
And that little high would last for a couple days, weeks, but I would always find myself relapsing again. Romans 2:4 says that it's the kindness of God Some translations say the goodness of God that leads us to repentance. And it's interesting because I was using my badness to lead me to repentance instead of God's goodness. And I think it's one of the
Mm,
critical things that we must understand when you do relapse and when you do have setbacks and you do hit a little bit of a bump in the road. Don't get so caught up in how terrible you are. Start to fixate yourself on how good God is, because that is the thing that's actually going to draw you into the life He's called you to lead. Whatever you stare at grows. So if we make a big deal of our mistake and our sin and how terrible we are, those things become amplified in our life and they start to cloud us from actually seeing God for who He really is and seeing what He's offering to us, which in those moments is mercy to be forgiven, to be pardoned of the dire consequences that come from sexual sin. But secondly, the grace, which is the empowerment to actually become like Him, to learn from that experience, to say, what was going on there? What can I do differently next time so that it doesn't happen again? We can actually be proactive about it, but we have to make sure that our attention is in the right direction. Because if it's not, we'll actually just get consumed in our badness and we'll stay stuck as a result. And with that kind of thinking, it's really only a matter of time before you have another relapse. But when you're focused on God, actually, you can have your last relapse by learning from the previous experiences and
mm.
ensuring they don't happen again.
Yeah. And I think so much of that is helped and aided by community, which is why it's so important to have accountability and to have people you talk to because God designed the church to be a community of believers who can hold one another to account, who can spurn one another on to success and to deeper relationship with Christ. But it raises the question about the fact that pornography is such a pervasive issue, not just within culture, but within the church. And so many
Yes.
spiritual leaders who are struggling with the issue of pornography. I don't as much have a question as I just want to know, how do you grapple with that? How have you discussed that in your ministry?
It's really tough. I mean, there's this well, we know that like pastors and leaders are shepherds, right? They're shepherds of the flock that God has entrusted them with. And their responsibility is to guide their sheep through the different pastures of life. And somewhere in those pastures, there's a little area. It's actually a big area. It's called sexual integrity. And a lot of shepherds are not able to lead
Mm,
their sheep there because they don't have access. And what you're pointing at is a big deal because if leaders don't get their own lives cleaned up, they will fear bringing in the resources and the people that could actually help their congregation out of a fear of being a hypocrite, being found out, losing their job, et cetera, et cetera. Totally understandable. I mean, I struggled while I was a pastor myself. I pastored for 10 years. I know what it's like to go there. But I think, if anything, it's just a call to the leaders to rise up, to own your stuff, to understand that
mm.
hey, nobody's perfect, and you're not expected to be perfect either. But the longer that you delay getting the help yourself, the longer you delay the very people God has called you to serve with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so I think it's really important that leaders do rise up. And for me personally, we are working really hard to resource the local church. And when I say local church, I do mean the physical buildings and the different bodies that you're going to find all around the globe. Um, but what I really mean is the church, like the believers at large, whether you're in Venezuela or
Yeah.
in America, wherever. And so we have a daily podcast, we have a weekly newsletter, and we're really trying to equip people so that maybe a leader who doesn't want, they're not ready to talk to their board, they're not ready to talk to their congregation about it, they can at least start getting the help and gain the development so they can reach that place where they're ready to actually confront the issue in a bit more of a public environment.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think that's fantastic, and it leads me to the transition. I want to talk a little bit about your book as we close out our conversation here. So, the last relapse, and you talk a lot in the book about intimacy. And look, pornography, as you know, completely warps a man's view of not only relationships but intimacy. So, I wanted to ask if you could give us maybe I know this is a big word and has a lot of meaning, but a godly definition of what intimacy is in relationship.
Yeah, for sure. The biblical word for intimacy, we typically see it as knowledge. That's kind of the English word. But if you look at the Greek word, especially gnosko, it's the same kind of word that's used to describe when two people have sexual intimacy with one another. It talks about how um, Mary was a virgin; she did not know Joseph. They didn't have that kind of intimacy, and it gives us an idea that there's something about that personal knowledge of one another that really defines intimacy. Our operative definition in our community is that intimacy is being seen, known, and understood. And those things do not happen without a conscious decision. I think we kind of assume God knows everything about us. So what's the point? But it's interesting if you look at scripture like Matthew 6, where Jesus teaches the disciples to pray, he says, your Father in heaven knows everything you have need of. Therefore, when you pray, pray this. And he teaches the Lord's Prayer. And it
Mm,
tells us that God is not looking for our engagement with him to increase his cerebral knowledge because he does see everything, he does know everything. What he's actually looking for is heart knowledge. He's looking to understand us better. And that requires us making a conscious choice for God to see us in our brokenness, see us in our hard times, and of course, see us in our good times as well. And it gets cultivated with time. Intimacy is never built overnight. The only kind of intimacy you can experience overnight is a complete counterfeit. It's something that we would never want to participate in.
mm,
Good intimacy actually takes time to build. But the really amazing thing, Trey, is that when you start to open your heart up to God, He starts to open up His heart to you. And so this beautiful two-way street takes place where God is getting to know me better, and I'm growing comfortable with God seeing me, even in my imperfections. But similarly, God is also letting me see more of His heart, more of the things that really make Him burn. You know, when I wake up in the morning, my favorite thing when I talk to God is I ask, "How are you doing?" Because I love to hear what's on his heart. I
mm.
love to hear how he's doing. I love connecting with him that way. And intimacy doesn't have to be super touchy feely. It can be deeply personal and emotive. Sometimes it is just the simple back and forth conversations that take place throughout the day. But whether it's that or something in between, the point is that we are consistently making that choice to be seen, known, and understood. And we're making an equal effort to see God, to know God, and to understand his heart.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's so important to see how multifaceted intimacy is and what it means. Because I think the world will try to tell us that intimacy is synonymous with sexual gratification. Certainly, that's what pornography teaches us. But intimacy
Yeah.
is so much more. It's so much richer. I can have an intimate relationship with God. I can have an intimate relationship with my sibling, and those things are not sexual in nature, but it's to truly know somebody, and it when it's in a marital relationship, it just makes the sexual intimacy that much greater when you have true relational intimacy. So I think it's fantastic that you've written this book and that you talk about intimacy in it. And I want to ask you why you decided to write the book now, and then lastly, where people can go to learn more about your ministry and to purchase the book.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the stats are really clear that the consumption of pornography is on the rise. The pandemic had a huge impact on that as well. So I think the timing of this is actually very significant because people are struggling now more than ever before. And if they don't get the
Mm,
help and they don't reverse some of the impacts and some of the bad habits they developed during the pandemic, we're going to see like all of humanity just slowly dwindle away these next 10, 15 years or so post pandemic. So I'm on a mission to kind of change the narrative. I want to see guys get free in masses. That is my aim. That's kind of my goal. And the book was the best way to do that. We don't hold anything back. So, you know, we have programs that cost some money to participate in, but really the goal of this book was to make it as affordable as possible for people to get the help that they need. Not just the concepts, but the practical tools. It comes with a free workbook. There's a masterclass. There's a whole bunch of resources that we try to provide you so that we can say, hey, don't just read the book and move on, but actually put this stuff into practice and start gaining the freedom that God has afforded you. So that's really our heart. 10%
mm,
of all book sales are going to go to a charity in Uganda that we really support as well. So we're doing our best to really make this something that that has like a global kind of impact because I think that's what this is really all about at the end of the day. And the best place for people to find it is on any major platform. It's called The Last Relapse. It's really available worldwide. And if people do want to connect with us, there's lots of ways they can do that. But the way I would love for them to is to find me on Instagram. It's just Sathiya Sam. We're putting out content there daily to help people in their journey. And we have other reasons. We got a daily podcast and the newsletter and all that stuff. But Instagram would be a great place for them to find us.
yeah, and I wanna say too, that's actually how I connected with you, Sathiya, was over Instagram. You're very active and
Yeah,
very
yeah.
accessible, and y'all's ministry is incredible. I think you're doing great work, so thank you so much for writing the book and for taking a few minutes to join us at CBN News and Faithwire to talk about it.
Thanks for having me, Trey. My pleasure.